What makes for a really good entry-level horror movie? Personally, I think that well-roundedness without veering into any extreme or potentially offensive territory is the key. Also, a PG-13 rating or lower would help as well, simply for the fact that it's hard to become interested in movies that you're not actually allowed to watch as a young kid. For that reason, I think that today's movie, Poltergeist, from 1982, is one of the best entry-level horror movies out there. I can't say for sure because I haven't asked her beforehand, but I'm pretty sure my mom likes this movie, and if she doesn't like it, she, at the very least, would be able to tolerate it, which means that it's probably a pretty decent piece of entry-level horror. The mythos that surrounds this early 80s supernatural horror film is one that has been contested more or less ever since its release. Some people even think that this movie is cursed. Yeah, it sits in that unique pantheon of horror movies whose productions and circumstances surrounding them were so bad that some of the most superstitious of us had no choice but to believe that they were probably cursed. Poltergeist follows the story of a suburban family made up of parents Stephen and Diane, played by Craig T. Nelson and JoBeth Williams respectively, and their 3 children. After some strange environmental goings-on in their house, their youngest daughter suddenly goes missing, which prompts them to seek outside help in order to bring her back. And that outside help comes from the several, paranormal investigator type people that they bring into the house. There's a couple of different characters, 3 or 4 different characters that come into the house to investigate the disappearance of their young daughter. Something about this movie that I didn't know, despite having watched it quite a few times, mostly on cable television, is that it's directed by Tobe Hooper, aka the guy who's responsible for the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I had no idea that Poltergeist and the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre are directed by the same guy. No clue whatsoever. The screenplay was written by Steven Spielberg, Michael Grayus, and Mark Victor. I hope I said second guy's name correctly. Michael Grayus. While Spielberg is not credited as the director of Poltergeist, he's often described as having been a pretty active producer on the movie who may as well have been considered a co-director alongside Hooper. His reason for not directing it himself is that around the time this movie was, undergoing principal photography, E.T. was also undergoing principal photography, and Spielberg was contractually required to not work on any other movies while he was in the process of working on E.T. Fun fact. As I said earlier, the conversation around Poltergeist pretty often leads to the discussion of 2 untimely deaths by some of the movie's child actors. Dominique Dunne, who plays the oldest daughter, Dana, was murdered shortly after the film's completion, and Heather O'Rourke, who played 5-year-old Carol Ann, kind of the star of the movie in a lot of ways, passed at a young age from a medical condition. While these are often kind of brought up to add to the mythos of the movie, I think it's important to acknowledge that these were both terrible, untimely events in real life that happened to real people. Poltergeist, the movie, isn't cursed, but some of the people involved with making it did unfortunately pass away. So there's that. However, also to be noted, is that Poltergeist is based on allegedly true events, or at least inspired by allegedly true events. While the content of the film is obviously embellished, certain events that happen particularly in the early stages of the movie are inspired by stories surrounding the legendary Harriman House in the 1950s, though the cause of paranormal disturbance at the real house was not determined to be because of a Native American burial ground on the property. With that out of the way, let's talk about the movie itself. Poltergeist is highly notable for just how influential it was on the genre of supernatural horror. Lots of ideas that would eventually become standard for haunted house movies were sort of perfected here. I'm not going to say that it started many of those trends, because there were 70s haunted house movies as well, like the Amityville Horror. One of the things that I find so interesting about Poltergeist is just how much it is able to get away with in the confines of a PG-13 rating. It's a real good example of how movies are rated differently now versus how they were rated at the time that this came out. There's a scene in this where a guy rips his own face off, revealing blood and muscle and tendons and eventually a human skull underneath all the meat. Granted, this sequence is eventually played off as a dream or an illusion, and the dummy that they use to perform the effect is laughably fake looking. Like, I remembered this scene was in the movie before I watched it, but I did not remember how bad it looked. It looks bad. It looks real bad. But it is a fairly gory scene to be spotted in a movie with this rating, regardless of how well the effect was actually captured. Also, in the end, when Diane returns through the closet with Carol Ann, they're all covered in some sort of like mysterious, chunky-looking strawberry jelly. It's not really described what it is in detail, but to me, it's always sort of read as being kind of a hellish, ghostly gore, kind of the filmmaker's way of getting, getting that blood-covered final girl without actually having to show how it is that she got covered in the blood. That way you can get that striking visual that a lot of horror movies try to get in that last act. It's loaded with other scenes that are generally frightening as well. One really memorable one is in the last 10 or so minutes with the big ghostly dragon gorilla thing shows up. This movie's really old, so I'm just going to show you a picture of it here so you can see what it is that I'm talking about. I'm not particularly worried about spoilers with this one. Despite everything that I've said about the movie to this point, it's not really a favorite of mine. I don't have much against PG-13 horror when it's done well, and I certainly see where this movie stands in the overall horror canon. But as a movie that I would just sit down and watch, I kind of doubt that I'll be returning to this anytime soon. It hasn't aged particularly well, and I don't find the child acting performances, of which there are several, to be very compelling. The performance given by JoBeth Williams as the mother is definitely the standout of the bunch, but the more I explore supernatural horror, the more I think I've come to accept that this genre just really isn't for me. I'm still interested in continuing our trend of Supernatural Sundays this month, because when I do find a good supernatural horror movie, they usually prove to be some of my favorites. It's just that the genre from the get-go is not particularly appealing to me, so I need to be really hooked by whatever it is that's happening on screen. One thing that I think is really effective about Poltergeist, though, is how much they're able to make seemingly mundane aspects of a 1980s home so unsettling, which I guess would be the intent behind a movie where, the most tangible enemy is the house itself, or rather the ghosts that are inside of it. All those visuals with the television screen and the static, they're really spooky looking. Or like just that whole, process of the national anthem playing before cable television went offline at midnight, which is a thing that used to happen. It's a big aspect of this movie. In the modern age of satellite TV, you can't really relate to it anymore, but it makes it seem particularly spooky. I'm sure it was normal for people of the time, but to me, the idea of like the national anthem just cutting to static is kind of scary, mostly because of this movie. All things considered, I would give Poltergeist around a 6 out of 10. I respect the effect that it's had on the genre as a whole, but like I said, it's just not really for me. The style of scares combined with the tameness of PG-13 horror in general just doesn't really give it that oomph that all my favorite projects within the genre have. It's still definitely above average, still much better than anything that could be considered bad, but it just doesn't happen to be one of my favorites. Thank you very much for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe if you liked this one. I get a feeling that a lot of people probably aren't going to agree with this one. They're going to want to put this movie at something like an 8 or an 8.5. But it's just not for me. So we'll see you in the next one. And I'm going to get out of here. Thank you very much.